Is Canada about to replace the US with China for its oil exports? Could this shift lead Trump to impose tariffs on Canada once more? Let's explore this potential game-changer in global trade. There is a turning point in Canada's energy industry, and the stakes are bigger than ever. The United States imported about 98% of all Canadian heavy crude oil exports and was the only buyer for decades. Because American refineries rely on Canadian heavy oil to produce gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, the two economies have been intertwined. However, this is no longer the case. The economic and geopolitical world is being shaken by Canada's growing reliance on the East, China, for its oil exports. There are a lot of questions now that Donald Trump is back in the White House. Will he impose Canadian oil tariffs in retaliation? Could Canada's growing energy partnership with China set off a fresh trade war fuse? Most importantly, what does this all mean for global oil markets? Let's take a look at the numbers to understand the magnitude of the shift. Alberta's energy exports to China in 2024 reached about $2 billion in crude oil exports, a five-fold increase over the previous year. The opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was the single most significant factor that caused the spike. The project, which had been hampered by environmental protests and regulatory battles for a long time, ultimately allowed Canadian oil to start flowing to the West Coast. In spite of global efforts to shift to renewable energy, shipments of crude may readily be shipped to Asian markets, particularly China. It is impossible to overestimate how important this breakthrough is. For many years, Canadian oil producers were subject to fluctuating prices, American policy whims, and even hostility because of their near-total reliance on American buyers. Are you familiar with the Keystone XL pipeline? A devastating blow to Canada's energy sector was dealt by the Biden administration, which abandoned the pipeline. The idea that Canada should diversify its economic partners in order to lessen its dependency on Washington was strengthened by that action. The gates to Asia have opened with the opening of Trans Mountain expansion. It's a survival shift, not only a logistical matter. At a time when global oil prices are unclear, major Canadian oil companies such as Suncor Energy, Cenovus Energy, Imperial Oil, and Canadian Natural Resources are increasing production. Thanks to a 13.5% increase in capital expenditures, Canadian Natural Resources alone is increasing its oil production by 12% in 2025. Although the US market will continue to be very large, these companies understand that having China as a backup consumer gives them stability and bargaining strength in the wild world of energy. However, Washington has noticed Canada's growing ties to China. Trump has long criticized Canada's trade policies, and now that he is back in the White House, his administration is using tariffs as an economic warfare tactic. Just a few weeks into his term, he invoked national security and border control interests to impose broad tariffs on Canadian imports. The White House long used the pretense of fighting illegal drug shipments along the US-Canada border, but many saw this as a stalking horse for a more protectionist agenda. As a payback, Canada has imposed tariffs on $107 billion in US exports. The first round of Canadian tariffs targets American vehicles, trucks, agricultural products, steel, beer, wine, fruits and vegetables, household appliances, and industrial inputs. The situation is reminiscent of the trade battle that Trump started during his first term when he placed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, only to have Canadian tariffs on American milk, ketchup, and whiskey reciprocate. The most important question, though, is whether Trump will intensify his attacks on Canadian oil. As the US increasingly views China as its major geopolitical and crude foe, there is rising speculation that his administration would impose tariffs or trade restrictions on Canadian crude. According to simple logic, Canada's increased oil exports to China benefit Beijing's economy at the price of US energy security. Trump may censure Canada for what he perceives as aiding a competitor as part of his America First policy. If that's the case, the impact might be enormous. American refiners would suffer the most immediate consequences. In the US refining market, heavy Canadian crude is mixed with lighter domestic oil. Without a Canadian supply, refiners would be forced to use alternative heavy crude from the Middle East, Mexico, or Venezuela, each of which has logistical challenges and geopolitical implications. By negotiating an agreement to purchase stable oil from Canada, the Biden administration attempted to avoid the potential increase in fuel prices. Second, tariffing Canadian oil would likely result in more Ottawa reprisals. Any move against Canadian crude would likely lead to further rounds of retaliatory tariffs, as the Trudeau administration has already demonstrated a willingness to respond to Trump's trade provocations. An open trade war would destroy industries well beyond the energy sector. Third, in the long run, China might gain from such a move. China would likely fill the void and strengthen its economic ties with Canada if the United States made it more difficult for Canadian crude to reach its market. A steady supply of Canadian oil would be a big coup for Xi Jinping's administration, which has been striving to diversify its energy sources in the wake of tensions with the United States. Trump doesn't want that kind of thing to happen, but his own policies might unintentionally pull Canada closer to China. By diversifying its LNG exports, Canada is hedging its bets in the meantime. With significant clients in Asia, the enormous LNG Canada project, which is expected to come on stream in the coming years, will significantly diversify Canada's energy trade partners. As a result of diversifying its reliance on China and the United States, Canada will have more flexibility in the world's energy markets. How Canadian policymakers and the general public will react to these trends is another concern. Although some Canadians are excited about the prospect of breaking free from their reliance on the United States, others are opposed to the country's increasing economic integration with China, particularly in light of Beijing's political aspirations and human rights record. The long-term choice of Canada's energy policy may play into this conflict. Will the government attempt to keep the US, China, and other foreign purchasers in play, or will it place the rancher's bet on China as a significant oil buyer? Leaders in the Canadian oil industry remain optimistic no matter these trends. They claim that the industry has already survived its fair share of storms, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2014 price fall. Many claim that since American refiners still require Canadian crude, the impact of Trump's tariffs would have been minimal. Others claim that Trump's protectionist agenda consistently harms American industries just as much as it does foreign manufacturers. Trump will be forced to roll back the policy if tariffs raise the price of gasoline because American voters will oppose it. The energy relationship between the United States and Canada is ultimately at a fork in the road. A matter of pragmatism, not politics, is Canada's shift to China. This is a backstop for the nation's energy sector, which has long been at the mercy of US policy. However, the uncertainty in the mix has increased since Trump returned to the White House. The oil markets, global trade, and even American consumers may be severely impacted if he intensifies the trade fight with Canada. What comes next? Is this a bluff for the election, or will Trump actually impose tariffs on Canadian oil? Will Canada attempt to mend fences with the United States, or will it keep heading back to China? How would all of this affect global economic stability, inflation, and energy prices? There is no doubt that 2025 will shape trade and energy policy in North America. So, that's it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. How do you think Canada's potential shift from the US to China for oil exports could reshape global trade? Could it trigger new trade tensions or even tariffs from figures like former President Trump? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more intriguing content. Stay tuned.